Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name is Carl Trueman. I am professor at Grove City College in beautiful Western Pennsylvania. And I'm here, as always, with my long-standing friend, perhaps my only friend, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Todd, I got your title perfectly right. First time.
I'm happy about that. You didn't have to hesitate. You knew immediately what church I serve, all that good stuff. Now, but it has to be
read cue cards better than our current president. There you go.
Well, yes, exactly. Of course, that's not particularly distinctive as a strength, but I do have to say, Carl, I mean, certainly you have more friends than me. You and I talked not long ago. You even had the distinction of making a few Muslim friends recently as well, out on the left coast.
I did. I had the interesting experience / privilege of being invited to speak at Zaytuna College, which is the only accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. And its campus is literally across the road from UC Berkeley. So it was kind of fun to be speaking about LGBTQ stuff within a few feet of Judith Butler's home territory. And as I joke with friends, the safest place for me to be in Berkeley is a bit like the Jews in medieval Spain. It's the Muslim enclave, really.
Right.
Nobody's going to pick a fight with them. And I had a very, very interesting time. It was striking how the room was full, must have been 250. Young Muslims, mums and dads, right, all very, very concerned about what is going on, not just within the California educational system, but within the United States as a whole. So it was a very, very interesting experience. I made some good friends there. And it's been interesting since, seeing how during Pride Month, some of the most prominent protesters of some of the Pride excesses are emerging within the Muslim community. So
it's interesting to see. It's interesting because the left has been noticing that, and I see far less cries and warnings of Islamophobia from them now. But in fact, chatting to the Muslims, it was very interesting. They were saying the left doesn't know what to do with us. Right. Because, our skin color is different. We are a different community, and it was interesting as well. Afterwards, there were a couple of people there. One of my colleagues, actually from Grove, happened to be in Berkeley and turned up. But there was another guy identified as probably a Christian in the audience, and chatting to him afterwards, turned out he was an elder in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And I made some comment to him. I said, well, this must be an unusual environment for you. And he said, oh, no, I know many of the families here. And I said, how do you do that? He said, well, I teach at the local Christian school. And many of these families send their kids to the local Christian school because they don't agree with my theology, he said, but they want their kids taught respect. They want their kids taught spiritual seriousness. They don't want their kids taught the crazy stuff that's coming out of California. So it just struck me as in the public square, I think there are some very interesting political alliances that may emerge in the next couple of years. And I had a blast. It was, I had tremendous fun there as well. So, well, that's good.
Anyway,
that's good.
We have a special guest today. In fact, he may be my other friend. You never know.
I thought I was going to have that recognition. I hope so.
I had the great pleasure and privilege of working with this gentleman for many years when I taught at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He headed up the practical theology department. I like to think of him as the PCA's answer to Frank Sinatra. Not that he is a professional crooner, though his wife has a beautiful singing voice.
Yes.
Trained singer. But he took to heart Frank Sinatra's famous advice that one should retire early and often. We've actually caught him in one of those moments when he's back out of retirement. It is, of course, my dear friend, former colleague, Tim Witmer, who was for many years pastor of Crossroads Church just outside Philadelphia, and is currently serving as interim pastor of the RPC Church in Ephrata, deep in the heart of Lancaster County. And we've asked him to come on today to discuss a new book that he's edited, The Shepherd's Toolbox. So welcome, Tim. It's great to see you again. Good to connect.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here and great to be unretired and also in the land of buggies and bicycles out in Lancaster.
Right. So tell us about the book, Tim. I mean, it's part of a series of books that you've been developing, though I think this is the first composite edited volume you've done. The notion of shepherding is very dear to your heart, but Todd, I think, is going to ask you about that in a few minutes' time. But what was the burden, the specific burden lay behind this book, and how did you choose the team you chose in order to put the volume together?
Okay. When the 10th anniversary of the Shepherd Leader was coming up, we talked about the possibility of doing an edited version of the Shepherd Leader, and decided that a better tack would be to look at some of the best practices that have come out of the work put into the Shepherd Leader by many churches. And so this team of authors are folks who, in my mind, have made a good contribution in certain areas of shepherding, and specifically, one of the bigger challenges that we've seen in this trying to apply the shepherding principles is what I call the comprehensiveness test, meaning how do you make sure that you are shepherding every member. And some of these churches have really done a great job of that. So these authors, actually, some of them I met at a consultation we put together for large church pastors. One of the challenges being that when churches reach a certain number, it's how do you shepherd thousands of people? And so some of these pastors were part of that consultation. I call it a consultation because it was really pastors interacting with pastors, because I've never pastored a church of 500 or 1,000 or 2,000. So it was really an opportunity for them to interact and to share ideas. So several of them I met there.
Yeah, it's not a pressing question in the OPC generally, not something we wrestle with at presbytery very often.
What do you do if you have a church of 1,000 in the OPC?
Well, you worry about you wonder about what doctrine the guy's soft pedaling on.
That's right, exactly.
Either that or you're already in the church triumphant.
There you go. Tim, when I was coming up in ministry in the 90s, late 80s and into the 90s, the church growth movement was in full swing. So many of us had made our pilgrimages to South Barrington, Illinois, and out to Orange County, California, and had gone to the conferences. And one of the things I heard repeatedly in my early days as a minister, and unfortunately continued to hear it, and you'll still hear it today from some influential megachurch pastors, is that this whole notion of pastor as a shepherd is no longer helpful. Shepherd was perhaps a helpful first century metaphor for people living in an agrarian society, but it's no longer helpful, and we need to find new metaphors to explain modern American life and the realities of megachurches, et cetera. But we need to get rid of, we need to drop this idea of the pastor as a shepherd. What is your response to that, and what is it about being a shepherd that's actually quite unique? But what do you think as you hear that? As I'm sure you heard that as well.
Yeah,
at various times.
The first thing to note is that there's no doubt that shepherding is hard. It takes time, and one of the things I like to say is anybody can draw a crowd, but it takes work to make disciples. And as a matter of fact, when I went to visit the Hers, who helped me with information about sheep in writing the Shepherd Leader, I noticed that they didn't have any sheep anymore. And I asked them, well, where are all the sheep? And they said, we don't have sheep anymore. We only have goats. And I said, why? And they said, well, the sheep were too hard to take care of. So, I mean, it's an intensive work, because what is required in ministry, and the longer I have served again and again and again in ministry, is that ministry is about relationship. And the heart of the shepherding metaphor is the relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. The dynamic verb to know defines it, as Jesus says, the shepherd knows the sheep and the sheep know their shepherd. And that's hard. It takes time. And I'm not sure, I can't characterize all mega churches this way, but I don't think also they embrace the Presbyterian polity of the piety of the eldership. That's really at the heart of what we're called to do in the church in terms of shepherding the flock. Another interesting anecdote: when I was working with the PT department at Westminster, I was actually trying to inculcate the metaphor into the curriculum in a more broad-based way. And one of the members of my faculty in my department at that time was the head of CCF. And he said, I don't know how shepherding is going to work these days, because it's such an antiquated metaphor. Yeah. And then I reminded him that the best-selling book, CCF book of all time, was called Shepherding a Child's Heart. Yeah. So I guess it connects at some level.
Yeah. It was interesting. About 2 years ago, I read a book that at that time was still pretty new, called A Shepherd's Life. It was by a English shepherd. His name is James Rebanks, and he's a shepherd in England, runs sheep, and he's since written a follow-up as well. As far as I know, he's not a Christian. There's nothing intended to be theological or reflective on the church. He literally writes about this life of being a shepherd in modern day England. And the thing that I found that was so fascinating about the book over and over again, and what was so confirming about it, was I can't think of any other vocation that's like being a shepherd to sheep. I just can't think of anything else like it. And so it's not just this metaphor that can be cast aside. There are unique things about being a shepherd, unique things about shepherding sheep, that are particularly relevant to what the scriptures call pastors to do. And my suspicion is that very often the desire to want to do away with that metaphor is perhaps, and I can't speak for everybody, but perhaps sometimes just a dislike for the task itself. Because, as you mentioned, it is hard. It is frustrating. It's never done, and
and sheep are what we call in Lancaster County shushlik, meaning that they've got their own personalities, and they're going to do their own thing, and they're just like people, like we are.
Nasty, dirty, and stupid was my experience. I grew up in a rural setting, built on the wool trade, and sheep are very stupid creatures.
You just gave me my next 3-point sermon about shepherding there, Carl.
One of the things I love about your books, Tim, and I remember a student once asking me at Westminster, what had made your book so successful? Because I think it was a bit of a runaway hit that no one sort of expected at the time. And it struck me as I reflected on it that you're one of the few, and I don't mean this in a patronizing way, I mean this as a compliment. You're one of the few guys who actually has had what I would describe as a normal experience of ministry, who's then gone on to write about ministry. And that's not to denigrate the John Pipers of this world. John Piper's book, We're Not Brothers, We're Not Professionals. These are great books. Of Tim Keller, of course, produced a number of books with pastoral angles to them. But by and large, most students at seminary are not going to have the kind of ministry that John Piper had or Tim Keller had. These are unique men, unique gifts who receive unique blessings from the Lord in many ways. Most of them are going to be ordinary guys working away in backwoods parishes, backwoods churches, they're not going to have a raft of, they're not going to be like Todd, has a pastor of, this, that, and pastor of overseas investments, pastor of, this, that, and the other.
He lives in the Cayman Islands. Yeah.
They're going to have to do everything, maybe even organize their own schedule, for example. Right. And one of the things I love about your book, Tim, is you can read your books and think, I can do that. That's going to be something that as a local pastor or even just as a member of a local session, that resonates with me. I understand that. Have you found that to be the kind of the response you've been getting over the decades since the first book's publication? Have you had a lot of very positive response?
Thank you for your kind words, Carl. I appreciate that. I remember when I was voted full professor at Westminster, and you got up to spoke at the lunch, and the vote was unanimous, and you said the only one what was the quote? You said the only one who was voted unanimously has no enemies, or
the man who has no enemies has no honor.
Yeah. Well, I think, my writing style is very simple and very practical, and people have kind of, I know some who shake their heads and say, it's so simple, and it's not rocket science. It's like you say, it's just taking the scriptures and applying them practically to ministry situations. And no one was more surprised at how well received the book has been than I was, and continue to be.
And if there was, this is a cliched question, Todd will no doubt have more questions, but one thing I'd like to ask you, and it is a cliched question, but if there's something now that you wish you had known on the day that you were ordained to your first pastorate, if there's one piece of wisdom that you'd like to pass on to the next, I'm sure there are many things now that you didn't know, and it's probably good that we don't know some of the things that are coming, otherwise we'd never do the job in the first place. But what is the one thing that you think the newly minted pastor today really needs to know about pastoral ministry beyond the usual? He's got to preach, he's got to minister the Lord's Supper, this kind of thing. What's the key thing?
I think when I was asked a question on one of my retirements. What was?
Do you remember which one?
No, actually, I was asked, what is the best part of pastoral ministry? And I said, the people. And then they said, well, what's the worst part of pastoral ministry? And I said, the people.
Yeah.
But looking back, Carl, I would say that I wish someone had told me to invest more time in men. Because one of the things that I experienced in my ministry and have seen in churches with which I've consulted through the years is just the lack of elders. Where are we supposed to find these leaders? Where are the leaders? Well, you don't have leaders because you don't invest in the men in the church. And it's like you don't have green beans in your garden because you didn't plant green bean seeds. It's just fairly logical. But I would tell men that it's ministry is harder than you think. It's going to be harder. It's going to be more blessed than you think. But think of ways to invest in the men of the church.
Yeah. Tim, it's interesting to say that because we're finding the same thing, just the vital nature of that in the church I serve. So each one of us who are teaching elders on our staff, each one of us have a small group of men that we're teaching, that we meet with on a regular basis. And we do everything from Bible study to I've been working systematically through the Westminster Confession of Faith with a group of men, and we do it primarily for two reasons. One, because we're elders and we need to be teaching, but also to disciple men and to simultaneously keep an eye out on men that we think there's a potential officer, there's a potential teacher, deacon, elder, someone, and to see how we can be building them up, and we've found that to be incredibly important. Let me ask you this, Tim, on a related note. What would you say, or how would you kind of counsel pastors to think about, counsel elders to think about how we shepherd our sisters in Christ in the church? Now, obviously, we're shepherding everybody when we preach, when we lead in prayer, all of those things. We're shepherding the whole flock. So no question about that. But it's also different in the way that we relate to men. It should be, it has to be. But what are some things that you would encourage sessions to think about to make sure that they are caring well, or that their sisters in Christ in the church are being cared well for? Because there's just some things we can't, give them. What do you say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's the question that came up over the years as well. Well, so if you're making shepherding contacts, you're often interacting with the head of the household, and not so much with the wives. And how are you to deal with the comfort level of, well, you tell a guy, well, I'm going to be texting your wife now to see how she's doing.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
This is one of the I think one of the highlights of the Shepherd's Toolbox. There's a chapter in there written by a women's ministry leader.
Yeah.
And she in Oak Mountain Presbyterian Church in Birmingham has led an effort to identify women who would be able to reach out to the women of the church. They're not elders, they're not ordained, but they're coming alongside the elders to reach out to the women of the church. It's a redundancy in shepherding, and it's just so brilliant to me. Titus 2 talks about women training, older women training younger women, but I think this provides, under the authority of the elders, an opportunity for women to comfortably relate to other women who may express their concerns.
Yeah.
I think that's the best thing I've seen so far.
Yeah. Tim, you have, as Carl mentioned earlier, when you served as a pastor in the Philadelphia area, what were the best things about having a good long tenure, and how it, and not everybody is supposed to have a, I was reading, I've been reading a really great 2-volume set on the Princeton Theological Seminary as it was founded, and that sort of thing. And some of the great ministers at that time would serve for several years at a church and then be called to another. And so there is some of that, but there's something also very, very special about being able to plant your roots for a good long while. What were the chief advantages you experienced as a man who served there at Crossroads for a good long time?
I think, first of all, to recognize that it really takes time to get to know people and for people to trust you. I know this has changed in a Methodist church, but I could never figure out why they would move people every 5 years or so. Because really only at 5-year mark that you start to gain the trust of people. And even, okay, if shepherding is knowing your sheep, it takes that long to really know them.
Yeah.
And so I'd say that it's important because you're really in a long tenure, sense that you become part of a family that's mutually loved, mutually trusted. And that's important for you as a leader. And it's also important because because you know you're going to be there for a while, or you hope you're going to be there for a while, you got to deal with things.
Yeah. You
can't say, well, I'm not going to deal with that person because I'm not going to be here that long. Or I'm not going to do this ministry because I'm not going to be here this long to see it through. I think McShane's quote is, when you're called somewhere, figure you're going to be called there the rest of your life. And that was my attitude at Crossroads. And of course, it was a very exciting ministry because it was a multi-ethnic. This young country lad from monochromatic Lancaster County thrown into the city with one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country. Yeah. God has a sense of humor, but that shows that all the glory goes to him too. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's the family, it's the trust, it's the longevity of ministry. Long tenure really affects your attitude in many things.
Yeah. And isn't it true, when we're called to serve somewhere, there's a sense, I mean, if God calls us, we begin in a place of love for these people. We love them. And yet that can only go so far until you actually really invest enough time to know these people. Mm-hmm. And so that, giving our heart to these people, which is a risky thing, but pastors have to do that. That takes time. And it takes effort, and it takes being disappointed, and it takes times when you mess up and they mess up and you have to forgive one another. And
yes.
All of that takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah. And one of the joys that I had, and I'm sure you've experienced this, Todd, is I baptized a young baby that I baptized. I did her wedding before I left, and that was really great. Yeah. Great experience for sure.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about Jesus's words to Peter when he really kind of reinstates Peter into service, and it's that challenge of do you love me, and the application of which is then love my lambs, feed my lambs, and that our vocation as ministers is to love Jesus by loving his people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we can't pull that off, we're not going to be of much service to the Lord.
Yeah, so. You're exactly right. That's why when the Shepherd's Toolbox came out, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't viewed as a book of techniques, but the first chapter is read this first, which makes that very point that right. Our motivation has to be right, or the rest of it's not going to make it.
Yeah. Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining us. And I want to say to our listeners, please visit our website, mortificationofspin.org, and you can enter to receive free a copy of Tim Witmer's newest book, The Shepherd's Toolbox, Advancing Your Church's Shepherding Ministry. And I would encourage all of you pastors out there to get a copy of this. I would encourage church sessions to get a copy of this, to read these chapters, to discuss their content, and to continue to mature in this calling that we have. This really is what the title describes, a toolbox, a collection of chapters, each addressing and developing a particular dimension of this call that we have to love God's flock, to shepherd his sheep, and to do it faithfully. And we are thankful once again that Tim joined us today to talk about this really blessed calling in this important matter. We're so grateful that you listened in on this program today. If you'd like to make a contribution to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can do that on our website as well. Until then, we will look forward to being with you all next time. And the land lies down.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.